Deleted session. April 14, 1981. Now, good evening. For Ruber, you do not lead people anywhere. You cannot force them to change their beliefs. No more hypnotic fanatic leads any group of people astray. You make your own reality. The people use the materials of the world as they come into contact with them, in their own ways and for their own reasons. To imagine that you or anyone else can lead large masses of persons astray is a highly erroneous conception. In a larger sense, for example, the Catholic Church was originally formed as a psychic organization on psychic levels by large groups of individuals, as the mass psyche formed the basis of Christianity. If you believe that your own great energy can lead others astray, you are actually saying that others have no power of their own. Ruber has been extremely cautious in the past, wanting to make sure, as mentioned, that he was not leading others down the proverbial garden path. He did not feel the same way about his poetry, which largely in its way states the same messages that our own books do. The books are different, however, while the poetry carries the more clearly recognizable stamp of his accepted identity. So he was afraid that I would lead people astray unwittingly, perhaps, through the energy and power of our communications. That worry persisted, regardless of what kind of status he assigned to me. The relationship, of course, is unusual. Very few people have such issues to contend with. Ruber discovered how basically easy it was to have Alsatians, but also how basically easy it was for his, say, Seasoning and Jane's books also, for creatively he moved very quickly. Ideas of using considerable caution have been with him for that matter before the sessions began. When he recognized his own energy, the ease with which he could encounter people, as for example, when he acted as a salesperson years ago, sometimes gathering small groups at the street corners in Florida, he learned to fear his own energy to some extent, or rather, he believed that he must be very cautious in its use. Those habits were there, again, before the sessions began, and they have their basis in the Church's concepts of the sinful nature of the basic self. Most people operate at one largely exclusive state of consciousness. Even most creative work is done at the recognized threshold of the normal waking consciousness. Ruber was presented himself with a situation in which large portions of his creative life appeared in books that were written in another state of consciousness entirely. Little wonder, then, that he felt he must alert all nature and normal controls. In that regard, his symptoms developed more along the lines of exerting caution rather than, say, seeking protection. It is as if someone on his own developed a spectacular, amazing fast craft, and built a secondary system, a backup system, that allowed for great braking power in case this was necessary to offset the craft's own speed. He felt it his duty to examine his psychic material with supercritical force, since it seemed to come from the other side of consciousness, so to speak, and since it presented such a different picture of all aspects of reality. His symptoms served other purposes as well, though, as has been given often, in a fashion they served as regulators that he felt at one time allowed him to live on an even course. Tempering spontaneity or psychic exploration lest it progress too quickly for him to follow. yet also protecting him from other distractions so that he could continue his explorations. In other words, he felt he needed a countering force for his own spontaneity. He received some ideas of that nature from you in the past. In a way, the symptoms were almost a method of presentation that in another fashion completely paralleled your own nose. Well noted, an excellent point. They said in that regard they were meant to show that he was as reasonable, orderly, critical, and responsible as your nose certainly showed you to be. The symptoms have fluctuated, serving sometimes one purpose more than the other, but what you have overall is a belief in a kind of breaking power with which to handle spontaneous activity. Again, that belief in the need for control is rooted in the earlier concepts of the sinful self, concepts that have come to the fore in current contemporary world events, with the new attention being given to religious causes and religions. Current events can trigger such reactions, therefore. Robert has told himself that such feelings were beneath him, but often the feelings themselves went underground. Those feelings were nearly incomprehensible to you, so that it was difficult for you to see how they could even be taken seriously. It was in mass events and the God of Jane that the usual concept of the sinful self was most directly and vigorously addressed, and in which the value of individual impulses was stressed with consistent vigor. Robert has been dealing with that material since then. Many people in your society and others are dealing precisely with the same issues, though in different contexts. You are in the process of changing your definitions of yourselves as creatures, and each person is in one way or another involved. The idea of the sinful self has served as a large portion of that definition for centuries, bringing with it innumerable difficulties. Of course, as Robert frees himself from that idea, as he must and can, the need for such unnecessary cautionary behavior will dissipate by itself. It is no coincidence that you have been relatively free of that concept in its traditional religious connotation. You worked that out in your living existence to a large extent. And because of your own preparations for a life in which you are now involved. Again, the issue is not some hypothetical one, but one that directly affects people's most private actions. It must be swept aside and recognized clearly as having no natural part to play, for it is an anti-nature concept, flying in the face of the good intent of each of nature's individuals of whatever species. If you consider the self as good, you feel free to express it and its abilities. Some of Robert's ideas along those lines were highly reinforced by his mother as well as by the church, and later in its way by the very pronouncements of science. Since Robert's work involved him more directly in an examination of the self and in the unknown reaches of the psyche, then his experiences led him into a conflict with the idea of the sinful self. One of the main points of his work and mine is the definition of the well-intentioned self, of course. Robert was to some extent afraid to accept that concept fully. Therefore, he has been unable to utilize it fully in his mistaken belief that he must maintain a largely critical stance. That is enough for this evening. Rob asked, "Can I ask just one question?" They said, "You may." Rob said, "This morning Jane said she was beginning to understand that if she turned her focus away from her symptoms toward some place outside of herself, that she might improve by giving her body the freedom to do so. I was surprised because I thought she understood this. They said he has had such glimmerings briefly in the past, but was not able to separate himself far enough from his physical situation to understand that issue clearly. The material I gave this evening should help him see the reason for the problems behind the symptoms. It is humiliating to realize that you consider yourself as a sinful self, potentially evil, and to encounter the feelings themselves. So Ruber has shoved them underground. In personal terms, he feared that his father abandoned him for that reason, that his mother disliked him for that reason, for each person will interpret the belief in his or her own life according to circumstances. He thought that he was such a bad person that he drove his parents apart, perhaps caused his mother's illness, perhaps his grandmother's death, for which his mother did indeed several times blame him. And that the classical idea of the sinful self was individually interpreted in that manner in Ruber's personal early life. His mother told him he ruined everyone he touched. Those experiences were relatively unfortunate enough, but they were a part of the early life of someone who later finds themselves embarked upon in the study of the very nature of the self, so that they led him to believe that strong cautionary methods must be used, period. If Ruber had been involved in other endeavors, requiring unusual amounts of expression and creativity, however, the same cautionary methods would also have been activated to varying degrees. I am not implying that he was so fated to behave. The prosaic reasons for the beliefs, however, do lie in his private background and to that extent in experiences humiliating for an adult to recall. Instead, Ruber tells himself he should be above such feelings, or that they simply should no longer apply. They are not destined to apply, but there is a give and take between the future and the past. Understanding those issues can further help Ruber give up the entire construct. A good question and a good evening. Ra said thank you.